Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the Advancing U.S. Nuclear Research and Development, a briefing and discussion on the VTR. My name is Craig Piercy, and I'm the Executive Director and CEO of the American Nuclear Society. I'm excited to join you for this discussion and moderate our panel of experts a bit later on. Before we dive into today's conversation, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. All attendees are currently muted and will remain so throughout the webinar. Please enter your questions in the question box on your screen. We have an audience Q&A portion with our panelists later in the webinar. During the webinar, Kamal Pashmagalu, Executive Director of the Versatile Test Reactor Program, will provide a brief overview of the facility, including an update on the recent Critical Decision 1 announcement. Then we'll move into a panel discussion with our group of experts from industry, think tanks, government, the labs, and academia. I'll introduce our panelists later on. And then we'll wrap up our webinar with your questions. The webinar is being recorded and will be made available online. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. As some of you may be aware, the VTR is the first new test reactor that the Department of Energy has pursued in at least 30 years. Once built, it'll be a one-of-a-kind facility that can perform tests and research simply not possible with today's infrastructure. Like other test reactors in the DOE complex, VTR will support innovative research, development, and technological advancements for decades to come. VTR will help scientists and engineers create longer lasting and more efficient fuels, materials, sensors, and instrumentation required for a new generation of nuclear technologies. VTR truly represents a key enabling capability to design, test, and advance the technologies we need to help our planet prosper. The VTR team is comprised of 6 national labs, 10 industry partners, and 19 universities. The team has made significant strides towards identifying the different tests and VTR research needs that need to be accommodated. Team members have also been focused on designing the reactor, test vehicles, and other components to be as adaptable as possible, and also to develop an informed schedule and cost estimate. When operational, the VTR will be a DOE scientific user facility in the classic sense, welcoming researchers and developers from across the US and around the world. Together, these experts will create a collection of shared knowledge that can help usher in a new generation of nuclear technology. So now I'd like to turn it over to Kamal, Executive Director of the VTR program, to provide more detail about the program, including recent progress and updates. Kamal, over to you. And I believe you're muted.
Thank you, Craig. And good morning, everyone, from cold but sunny Idaho Falls. As Craig indicated, I'd like to give you a very brief overview of what VTR is and where we are with respect to the project status. I'm going to keep my overview short because I think a lot of the questions will be later answered by the panel. The first slide I have on the deck, as Craig indicated, I'm the Executive Director of the VTR project. Moving on to the first slide, that is the program started officially in 2018. The very first thing we did was to put a clear and compelling mission statement for VTR. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide because the different pieces that are on this slide will be talked about by the panelists from their specific perspectives. But as Craig indicated, what we are trying to develop is really a state-of-the-art test reactor, and I emphasize test reactor, to enable continuous innovation for advancement of nuclear energy technologies during its lifetime. And we are designing it for a lifetime of about 60 years. Now, when I say test reactor, I just want to emphasize that what this machine is doing is producing neutrons that will enable us to conduct the experiments that we want to conduct. We are not going to produce any power with this specific reactor. So it is basically a neutron machine. The mission need for this reactor was approved in February of 2019. And the recent milestone was the approval of Critical Decision 1 in DOE parlance, or in the parlance of DOE Order 413-3B, which is the Major Systems Acquisition Order. What did this? The approval of Critical Decision 1 basically completed the analysis of alternatives, approved the conceptual design and the conceptual safety design for the facility that we are proposing, and it also approved the cost and schedule range. In parallel to proceeding with the project under DOE Order 413-3B, DOE is also conducting environmental impact statement in compliance with NEPA that has started a little more than a year ago. We are almost ready. In a week or so, we are going to be publishing the draft EIS for public comment with the objective of releasing the final EIS in the spring of 2021 and leading to a record of decision in summer of 2021. Now, what's going to be in the record of decision, and I think this is important for us to emphasize, is certainly a no-action alternative is a possibility that at that point we don't proceed. If we proceed, the other important part of the record of decision is the site selection. Where are we going to build this reactor? And sometimes I see in the trade press that the reactor is being referred to INL's VTR. I want to make sure that the audience is clear about this. The site is not selected yet. INL is one of the options. It is the preferred option for the reactor. But the environmental impact statement is also evaluating Oak Ridge National Laboratory as an alternative site. In terms of the fuel fabrication, where we are going to fabricate the fuel for this reactor, INL also is one of the sites being looked at, but Savannah River site is another site. For fuel fabrication, there's no preferred alternative. Both of them are being evaluated similarly. So what is the conceptual design of this VTR? I'm not going to bore you with a lot of the high-level requirements that we started with, but certainly we want a very high neutron flux. We want high fluence, high availability of the reactor. We would like to have high test volumes so that we can test fuel bundles with appropriate lengths for fuel qualification purposes. We want to have a flexible test environment with respect to different coolants that people are considering in the development of different types of reactors. We are also looking at putting a rabbit, which is a vehicle for us to quickly insert small samples into the core while the reactor is still operating and remove those samples. In terms of the fuel cycle part of it, we want to take advantage of the existing facilities as much as possible. For example, for fuel fabrication, we are not envisioning that we are going to build a new fuel fabrication facility. We'll take advantage of the existing facilities either at INL or at Savannah River site or a combination of the two. Our target date for start is 2026, and obviously we want to make the cost as small as possible, and typically that translates to at least as a first order of magnitude as small as possible reactor core. So we settled down to about 300 megawatt type full type sodium cooled reactors. We are basically optimizing the core for that reactor to enable the testing that we need to do. Again, we are not optimizing for the core for power production, but for neutron production. For the rest of the reactor, we are heavily relying on the General Electric Hitachi's Prism A reactor that has a long development history, and it's a fairly mature design, including a fairly mature safety basis. And we have established for 7 different small teams that are looking at different types of experimental vehicles. And those teams are typically led by a national laboratory person, but it does include the industry partners that are interested in that specific experimental capability. And a lot of the universities, almost all the universities, are focusing in that aspect of the reactor. The core map up there gives you a flavor of what kind of experimental locations we will have. The magenta, the hexagons with the magenta are places where we will be putting the instrumented test assemblies. Those are fixed locations that we are going to drive into the reactor. We are going to design into the reactor. The capsules, the different coolant capsules, the cartridge loops that we have talked about will be inserted in there. And we are designing so that we can run at least a minimum of 10 experiments simultaneously. For all practical purposes, any of the fuel assemblies, the hexagons you see up there, can be replaced by a test. But we have also, with the lime green color over there, indicated some potential locations for those uninstrumented experiments. But those can go, again, based on the physics analysis, we can replace any of the test assemblies with those uninstrumented test vehicles. Cost and schedule range, I'm not going to dwell on that too much, but at CD1, we are estimating the point estimate with 20% contingency and management reserve is about $3.6 billion for this reactor. But with at CD1, with a large uncertainty plus 60% minus 30% uncertainty range. So we are talking about $2.6 billion to $5.8 billion. As I have indicated, we have already achieved critical decision 0, critical decision 1. The next step that's targeted for the second quarter of fiscal year 2023 is the combined critical decision 2 and 3, which finishes the engineering design, the preliminary and final design, and gives us approval to start the construction. And we expect to finish the construction by 2026 and with critical decision 1 for start operating the reactor. And there is a 5-year contingency on this schedule. It is again large uncertainty similar to the cost uncertainty given where we are at in this project. And those numbers will tighten up as we get closer to critical decision 3. As Craig indicated, currently we have 6 national laboratories working on this project. INL is leading the project on behalf of Office of Nuclear Energy in the Department of Energy. Argonne National Laboratory is leading the core design aspects of the project. In addition, Los Alamos National Laboratory, Oak Ridge National Laboratory, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, and Savannah River National Laboratory are contributing in their specific areas of expertise and leading the sub-teams in the project. We have currently 19 universities participating, primarily focused on the experimental capabilities and the future scientific use of this reactor. And we have 10 major industry partners at this stage. Those are the major partners. That does not include the small consulting companies or onesies and twosies that we are bringing in as the project needs. For conceptual design, we have used General Electric Hitachi with a subcontract to Bechtel under GEH to help us with the conceptual design. For the engineering, design, and construction phase of the project, we are currently negotiating a contract with Bechtel National Incorporated, which includes, that team includes Terrapower and General Electric Hitachi as their partners as well. In summary, as Craig indicated, we are trying to create a world's premier fast spectrum test reactor that with access by the technology developers, commercial developers, as well as scientists from all over the nation and possibly from certain parts of the world as well. This is, in my opinion, the last missing piece in our research and development infrastructure for us to reestablish U.S.'s global leadership and sustain that leadership. In the last 10 to 15 years, DOE has invested a lot in other pieces of the research and development infrastructure, including the existing test reactors, as well as any hot cell and glove box facilities to enable the research. With VTR coming into the picture and after it's integrated to the remaining of the infrastructure, I think it will certainly be the envy of the world. Even in the early phases of the design, VTR is already making some impact on nuclear energy innovation. For example, we heavily rely on integrated digital engineering framework to design, eventually construct, and subsequently operate this reactor. Along the same lines, we are exercising a lot of the NRC guides to look at the safety basis for this reactor and to establish the safety basis. And this reactor, just like other test reactors, will be authorized and operated under DOE authority. But we are working very closely with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and there's an MOU that was signed last summer with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. So in every step of the way, there's a lot of feedback loops between NRC and DOE. And there is certainly, since a facility like this does not exist today outside Russia, to some extent in China, there is a lot of interest from our nuclear energy allies and partners. We already have ongoing collaborations with France and Japan. And with that, I will finish my presentation. I will be happy to answer one or two questions if there are specific questions about these slides. But in general, I will probably defer some of the questions, and I prefer that the panelists answer the questions about the different perspectives for VTR. Mm-hmm. Craig, back to you.
Thanks, Kamal. So we do have one question from the audience. The question is, how could the different reactor concepts, such as sodium fast reactors, molten salt reactors, be tested at the same VTR facility? Are you going to switch all the core components between different experiments?
No, very good question, and I passed over that one fairly quickly. But what we plan on doing, those are the cartridge loops that I referred to that we plan on inserting into the instrumented experimental position. What we have in mind is a loop, self-contained loop. For example, if it is a lead technology, or if we want to test fuels and materials in a flowing lead environment, in large enough volumes that can be used for qualification purposes, we plan on inserting that cartridge loop into the core. The coolant never leaves the primary vessel of the reactor. The coolant stays and circulates inside the primary vessel in that isolated loop. And its heat is dumped into the primary sodium in there. But it does give us the environment with flowing coolant in contact with the materials and fuels that they want to test for that specific technology. And we can put up to 5 of those loops, assuming that we use one of those 6 locations for a rabbit. The other 5 locations in the instrumented positions, we can use up to 5 loops that can operate simultaneously inside the sodium pool.
Thanks, Kamal.
I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I know. I think that's a good explanation. So we have a question that's more sort of policy in nature. The question from the crowd: is there much bipartisan support on funding this project as the political atmosphere may change here in the next few months?
We are finding out that there is always a difference between authorization languages and the appropriation languages. The bill that strongly endorses this project was passed in the Senate and in the House by bipartisan support, and I believe that, at least in my lifetime, it's the only nuclear energy related bill that passed by 83 votes out of 100 in the Senate. So on the authorization side, there is a lot of support for the project. Now, the appropriations, obviously, at the end of the day, we would like to do all this stuff, but on the appropriation side, they got to balance the checkbook. So we will see exactly how much support we get on the appropriation. But in terms of the concept, in terms of the authorizing and recognizing the need for this project, there is bipartisan support, and I'm hoping that that will continue.
Good. Well, thanks for that, Kamal. So now is the time that we segue into our conversation with the panel of experts. So Kamal, thank you very much for that presentation. And what I'd like to do now is encourage the panelists to go ahead and enable their webcams so we can actually bring the panel to the screen. There we are. Let's make sure we have everybody here. It looks like we do. So let me start by just brief introduction of the panelists. So with us today, we have Ray Firstenow, Director of Nuclear Regulatory Research at the U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Judy Greenwald, who is the new Executive Director of the Nuclear Innovation Alliance. Sean McDevitt, Professor at Texas A&M University. Tara Niders, Senior Vice President of Program Development and Lab Facilities at Terrapower, and Tom O'Connor, the Federal Program Director for the VTR program. So good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to kind of go around the horn here and sort of give each one of you sort of an opening question that will then give you a little bit of time to make some opening remarks. But Judy, I'm going to start with you, Judy. You're new to your position at NIA, but you have broad experience within the federal sphere, White House, CEQ, DOE. Can you talk a little bit about how you see VTR as being important and the benefits that it offers from a societal perspective?
Yeah, thanks. Can you all hear me? Great. So the mission of my organization, which is the Nuclear Innovation Alliance, is to help accelerate innovation and commercialization of advanced nuclear power so it can be part of the solution to climate change. And we're seeing a lot of exciting innovation in advanced nuclear reactors with multiple companies pursuing multiple designs. And we have robust federal programs at the U.S. Department of Energy to support a few demonstrations, but we won't be able to provide that level of support for most advanced reactor innovators. So VTR provides these developers with a platform for testing their technologies, creating a more level playing field for innovation. The VTR also benefits US competitiveness. Right now, the US doesn't have a fast neutron test reactor where reactor developers can test their technologies. US competitors like Russia and China are pursuing advanced fast reactors of their own. And the US has a national interest in homegrown, successful advanced reactor commercialization. And that means having US developers develop and test their technologies here. It's important for the VTR to be built as rapidly as possible, preferably by 2026 as opposed to 2030 in the timeline range that we've seen, to be of greatest value to industry first movers, and also to ensure that as a country we can innovate fast enough for advanced reactors to help the US meet mid-century decarbonization targets. And the key issue, as I think the second questioner mentioned, is that the VTR is a very big ticket item in the context of energy appropriation. And failure to appropriate adequate funds to build the VTR quickly enough risks delays and cost overruns. There is substantial support for the VTR among industry as well as policymakers, but it's difficult to balance near and long-term innovation agendas and budgetary needs. And in our view, the best way to address this difficulty would be to increase overall federal investment in all climate solutions, including advanced nuclear power, to better match the societal effort with the profound societal challenge of climate change.
Thanks, Judy. Let me move over to Ray first now. Ray, can you talk us through the role that you see for the VTR from a licensing and regulatory perspective? You know, what impact is it going to have on NRC's ability to not only license but operationally regulate advanced reactors and meeting your mission of reasonable assurance of adequate protection?
Sure, thanks for that question, Craig. At the NRC, we really want to be ready for the new advanced reactor technologies, and we really see the VTR as a way to help assist us in that. As Kamal mentioned in his discussion, we have an MOU that we have between the DOE and the NRC. Matter of fact, a co-panelist here, Tom O'Connor, and I signed that MOU in September of 2019. And what it does, it really allows us to the opportunities to benefit from what's going on with the VTR, the new technologies that are being used in the design and construction, as well as the operation of the VTR, and of course the data coming out of it. I think the opportunities are there, as was also mentioned, the authorization to build and operate the ATR is being done under the DOE authorization process, which actually allows us a wonderful opportunity to engage more in what's going on with that and help learn from that. I think that it gives us the opportunity to understand how DOE is reviewing and authorizing the VTR. That will help us as we see licensing actions on advanced technologies. And it will also help us in the operation phase when we have the VTR operating. The data that comes out of it will be so important to help us validate our codes. And from a regulatory standpoint, research is really so much about understanding uncertainties and reducing those uncertainties. And the VTR and the programs planned for under that will really help with that. The test data will be invaluable for kind of filling in those gaps and help populate the dots to avoid just depending on extrapolations of codes. Because codes are nice, modeling and simulation is nice, but you need the data to help validate those codes. So those are a few of the things I see of just this wonderful opportunity for the NRC to be engaged in the VTR activities.
Thanks, Ray. So Sean, let's go to you. What do you see as the greatest R&D need for advanced reactors? What are you hearing from the user community?
Well, I think I'm going to be repeating a lot of what's already been said, but I want to say it a slightly different way. But ultimately, it is to enable a venue to allow these advanced reactors to move from paper tigers to built and functioning systems. There's a lot of work over the last couple of decades, whether it's Generation 4 work or advanced water reactors, a lot of different reactor concepts that have been pushed forward and developed and all kinds of paper studies. But there comes a point where you've got to prove it, just like Ray was just saying. You've got to do the demos in a prototypic neutron environment. You've got to do the demos in a system that gives you the data to move from what you call a technology readiness level 3 or 4 up to 6, 7, or 8 to get to something you can build, license, and operate. And so that's really, when you look at the advanced reactors, they're all sort of starting at different places. We know more about sodium fast reactors than we do about molten salt reactors, for example, or anything with lead or high temperature gas. But at the same time, what they need, what the applied engineering needs are centered around testing, proving data, and then eventually to a demonstration of some type. And so that's one of the key ones. So I would kind of call that the front line research need, the applied research lean. There's a second line to think about here, though, and that also gets into the science and technology development. Even though right now VTR is being designed for access and the different cartridge loops that Kamal has mentioned, that could be a molten salt cartridge or another cartridge, but you also get into the need to do materials development, a material that can contain a molten salt reactor, a material that can function in a high burn-up fast reactor. We don't have a venue in the United States to test those systems right now. There are some abroad, but they're complicated. And so having the ability to develop the materials is also a key research need. And then you get down a little bit more in the weeds, there's things that you can do with a reactor like this that are more sciencey or more like nuclear forensics. They need some short-term feedback. So, when you deal with this idea of a rabbit system that can send a sample back and forth in a few minutes, there's a lot of things you can do science-wise that we're not predicting right now. 10 years from now, or maybe 20 years from now, after this thing has been built, there's going to be somebody out there that might come up with an idea of, well, let's do this. So we don't know. So there's a certain sense we design for access. And one last thing to not underestimate, in my work here, I work at I do fuel cycle work, I do fuel development, but I operate the reactors here, and I have a workforce development plan. We're talking to high school students and middle school students. Something like this to excite the next generation of nuclear engineers and scientists is something that is invaluable to, those of us with hair less than dark. We're not going to be here in the careers in 20, 30 years. And the flood of people coming in, it's helpful to have something like this to excite them, to give them a vision for the future that we're actually going somewhere with nuclear technology. So that in its own sense, even though it's not directed towards science and technology, that's a research need too. So that's a broad comment, but that's more or less my 3 thoughts.
Thanks, Sean. So I want to go to Tara. So I guess in a way it's a similar question, but from your perspective, working for a company developing advanced reactor technologies, how do you quantify the need for a reactor like VTR?
Okay, so Terrapower is actually developing 2 different advanced reactors: the natrium reactor, which is a sodium-based reactor that we're developing with General Electric Hitachi, and also our molten chloride salt reactor. Both of those are fast reactors and would benefit from the VTR. For the natrium reactor, so there is a lot of known information about sodium fast reactors, as Sean has mentioned. But for us, what our real innovation on natrium is to make that reactor as economical as possible. And to get that economy, you need to do testing. And we have been developing materials that can have a much longer life in a higher radiation environment. We also have made changes into our fuel design such that we can improve the longevity of the fuel in the reactor. And this has been going on for several years. Unfortunately, we didn't have a VTR at the time, so we had to go to Bor 60 in Russia to have irradiation tests done. We don't want to rely on Russia for our testing needs. It's much more useful for us to have this done in the United States. We believe, Terrapower believes very, very strongly in testing. We just built a 60,000 square foot new lab facility where we test out all our reactors, but we're not going to be able to test those materials and that fuel in a reactor. That's got to be done at the national lab level. And so we look forward to having the VTR built so that we can get this testing done.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Tara. And finally, Tom. Tom, I want you to talk a little bit about why you think it's important for the U.S. to, invest in the VTR as a research capability.
Certainly. Before I embark on that answer, Craig, one of your earlier questions was in regards to congressional support. And Kamal certainly talked about the authorization and the appropriations. And one of the things that we're trying to do to grow bipartisan support, not only in the House and in the Senate, is by meeting with the House and Senate congressional appropriations staffers, both the majority and minority staffers, to give them updates on the project. In essence, to give them the kind of confidence that we believe they need in order to provide the kind of funding we believe is necessary in order to complete this project successfully. So we are working, certainly aware of it, and we're working very aggressively to try and address that situation. So in terms of why it's needed, well, let me start and look at it from a historical standpoint of view, and that is that, for the past 50 some odd years, the Advanced Test Reactor out at the Idaho National Laboratory has been providing irradiation capabilities in the thermal spectrum. And that has, in essence, resulted in the Navy now being able to run life of vessel cores. It has provided a significant amount of insight into light water reactor fuel performance. It's helped develop the triso-coated particle fuel. And now it's in the process of developing accident tolerant fuel. So it is something that over the 50 years has been a very integral part of US leadership in nuclear industry. So moving to VTR, as was pointed out by Kamal, it's important for the development of fuels and materials, instruments and sensors. We haven't had this capability in over 25 years. And as Tara pointed out, overseas really isn't an option for us. Not only is it not practical from a shipping standpoint of view, but it's really not viable. When you look at some of the tangential benefits as to why VTR is essential, as Ray kind of touched on, it's important because we're going to be demonstrating some of the advanced reactor licensing strategies. VTR, because it is a new build, it is going to be reinvigorating some of the nuclear supply chain. We are also testing some of the new approaches. So we're utilizing an integrated digital engineering to control the design and the construction. But effectively, it's creating a digital twin. It's a digital twin that's not only going to support us in the design and construction process, but it's also going to help us from a long-term operations. And as was mentioned, we'll provide the kind of data that would be essential for or useful in benchmarking any kind of codes. And then I can't but echo what Sean was saying in terms of energizing the industry. I think that the opportunity for somebody to come out and kick the tires to see what it really is all about is important. So I think at the end of the day, if you roll it all up, it's all about leadership. It's not only leadership in the United States, but it's a global leadership. Because at the end of the day, innovation isn't something that's one and done. Innovation is something that is going to be key to U.S. leadership in the nuclear energy industry for the next 60 years, and VTR has got to be an integral part of that.
So, now I got a couple questions that I want to sort of involve the group in, and I think it's important because there've been, several of you have noted, and I think Kamal noted earlier about, the funding and the ask, and so I want to turn it around and really talk about, what does our future look like if we don't have this capability, both in terms of getting first of a kind reactors done, and then in those future years as we're, iterating designs and so forth. Sean, I'll go to you first and then others can jump in, but I'm just kind of curious to see, what does your nuclear world look, what does the nuclear R&D world look like without VTR?
I think it's hard to predict, and I don't want to be too much of a downer, but at the same time, the projections for growth, and as we're beginning to shrink our current existing fleet, and the growth prospects come from advanced reactors and advanced modifications of existing designs, all of which requires access to real neutrons in real environments. You wind up having a lot of good ideas stop, or at least run into a brick wall, until they can get testing facilities to get the data they need in foreign activities. So you literally basically you turn the temperature down on the excitement. And if you think of it as any kind of a viscous fluid, I teach materials, so you're going from something that's flowing really fast to something that's very kind of sticky and molasses-like. It slows things down, reduces the excitement. It could cascade. I'm not saying it's the end of the world, but at the same time, it's going to put us in the mode of looking for the next innovation because we don't have one.
Mm. Tara, maybe I can go to you and sort of get get a perspective from a developer as to the implications. I mean, you mentioned having to go over to bore 60 to do some of your radiation tests. Talk about what not having a VTR, how does that change things for you?
It's really put us in a challenging position because we recognize that we don't want to be going overseas for that testing. There had been other places other than Russia that had that testing capability at one time, but no longer have that. So we do want to have that. We won't get the economics that we need if we don't have the VTR. I do think that the nuclear industry provides tremendous advantages to help prevent climate change, and we're not going to get there with just renewables. The solar and wind are wonderful. I strongly support them, but it's not enough, and they need to be on all the time. And so I do think that nuclear really complements the renewable energies. So I do think that there will be a transition to potentially smaller reactors. The advanced reactors fit very, very well as a complement to renewables. And I think it's something that the US has to do if we want to have a future.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to chime in? All right. So Tom, just a quick question for you. So I saw the sort of the target date is 2026. That sounds aggressive. Can you talk a little bit about that?
It certainly is aggressive. To echo one of the things that Kamal said, but in a slightly different way, he said VTR is about providing neutrons. It's not an electricity generation. And I guess the other piece to that message is that VTR is not a research and development project itself. It is a tool. And in order to ensure that we can bring this reactor online as quickly as possible, as low a cost as possible, and a machine that will operate reliably, we are using proven technology. So that was why the team from GE was chosen to take advantage of all of the design work that was done on PRISM, taking advantage of the licensing work that was done in conjunction with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. It is also take advantage of a proven fuel type. The fuel that we plan on using is a metal alloy fuel that has been run in EBR2 and FFTF, and so has a proven track record so that we know what it takes to manufacture it, how it's going to perform in the reactor, and how long it will operate. So with all of those things, we've got a good handle on what it's going to take. It's not to say that there aren't some areas we have to resurrect. To a certain extent, there's a need to resurrect the capability to manufacture the control rod drive mechanisms, the electromagnetic pumps, and some of the other pieces and parts. But as I mentioned, those are pieces that are fairly high technology readiness levels, and with that, I think that we can deliver in the time frame, subject to congressional appropriations.
Good. And help support the supply chain and along the way, right? And jobs
Sure.
along the way. We're getting a lot of questions from the audience, which is great. And so I'm trying to piece a few of them together here. A couple of questions on what is the impact of the VTR on the existing fleet in terms of both continued operations, and Ray, from a regulatory standpoint, how do you see VTR helping the current fleet?
Yeah, that's a great question, Craig. I think with regards to the current fleet, we're in the NRC and in the regulatory research we do, we have international partnerships as well as domestic to do material and fuels testing. And I think that one gap, and we do that with university reactors, with DOE reactors, with accelerators, with reactors overseas. But the one, I think the one big advantage of a machine like the VTR is that fast flux spectrum, that prototypic spectrum that we're going to see in many of the advanced concepts. But that fast spectrum also helps with materials as well. That DPA, that displacements per atom that Kamal mentioned in his presentation, 30. I mean, we can't get anywhere close to that with the thermal spectrum reactors. Thermal spectrum reactors have their purpose, for testing, absolutely. But to get that high damage rate on materials for future reactors, you really need a machine like the VTR to do that. So from a material standpoint, from code validation data, I think it's going to be indispensable to us.
Thanks, Ray. Anybody else want to jump in on that? If not,
just to make the point on materials testing, that there's never enough. And so having another venue to do more, especially at the high displacement per atom rate, is a benefit for the existing fleet. Strongly.
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, go ahead, Ray.
Yeah, if I could, that's right. I kind of missed the point of the question there, but when you're looking at materials and we're doing subsequent license renewals as we speak for the current fleet, because you got to remember, there's still almost 100 reactors out there operating in the commercial fleet that are going to be operating for a long time yet. And a machine like the VTR will provide information on material aging that we might not be able to get otherwise. So it is important to the current fleet.
So another question, and this could be to Sean, to you, but let's see, where is it here? Yeah. So do we already have a lineup of research projects on the books to use VTR? How is there a priority list? How does that work?
I wouldn't quite say it like there's a lineup of research projects, but I'm part of the experiments development team. And that's where all the universities are already funded to help develop these cartridge inserts. Kamal showed the reactor core map, and there were 6 purple hexagons. And each one of those is a location where you could stick these cartridge loops. And you think of them, they're about anywhere from 20 to 60 feet tall, and they can have all of the instrumentation in there so that you can have a fully instrumented lead loop that goes into the core to get access to the neutrons, or a molten salt loop, or a gas loop. They all have their own different problems, but basically the answer is we're building access for the things we know now, and we're building access for as much as we can within constraints for the things we don't know. So if, for example, somebody comes up with some new design of a reactor concept, if it can fit in that hexagon, a loop could be designed and inserted with proper study. With the Rabbit system, you can do all kinds of tests to prepare that loop. So there's not like there's a laundry list of applications, because there has not been a call for applications. At the same time, we're building it for access for the things that we know. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is, and I would imagine that the getting back to the sort of the excitement, you have people in the academic community that are thinking up things right now that they could use, right? So if there's not a formal list, there's energy there. All right, so this question from the audience, probably to Tom, how does the VTR plan to handle spent fuel?
So once it comes out of the core, and from a refueling standpoint of view, we're looking to run the reactor 100-day cycles, 20-day refueling outage. So we've got 300 days of irradiation, 20 days of, or 60 days total of refueling. Once it comes out of the core, there are in-vessel storage locations. And once it's reached a decay heat point where we can offload it into a dry cast, that's what we'll do. From a long-term standpoint of view, that may require the removal of any kind of sodium from the sodium bonded fuel. But we're also hoping that in the long run that we get to a metal alloy fuel that's extruded. So in other words, it doesn't need the metal or the sodium, and or that any kind of long-term repository doesn't require any kind of sodium removal. Just accept the material as is.
Mm-hmm. Great. All right, so let's see here. A couple of questions about, let's see here. Is it possible to enable a wide range of power density for different coolants like gas, molten salt, lead, and so forth? Tom, you want to try it?
Well, I was going to kick that one to Sean, because he's the one designing all the experiments and would be much better attuned to do it. Either that, or we're going to drag Kamal back in here.
Well, the truth is, I'm not designing all the experiments. I'm a principal designer on the Rabbit system, but I sit with the guys that are doing that. And I think the answer is yes, with caveats, because you design a loop, these cartridge inserts, and you're going to be seeking to hit certain target parameters. And so you've got you've got this almost 5-inch flat to flat hexagon. And so you're playing with dimensions, you're playing with gaps. Any type of fuel experiment, whether it's at ATR or HIFER or anywhere else, there's always some variables that you have to play with to get to the power densities you want. So we're actually in a position where, assuming we succeed and build the VTR, we have the highest fast neutron flux in the history of ever. You have the ability to manipulate it almost to where you need it, depending on gaps, shielding, thermalization, whatever you want to put in there to enable the test you want. I can't speak to each individual case, but it's, versatility is the word of the day here. We're trying to build something that's versatile enough, and part of being versatile enough is having enough fast neutrons to start with that if you need to dial it into something else, you can design your experiment appropriately.
Hmm.
And
Nice.
in conjunction, you not only have locations within the core, but given that all of the locations are uniform, you have the ability to insert an experiment into the reflector or into the outer regions of the reactor vessel itself. So you've got a lot of flexibility, versatility.
So a related question. So the questioner mentions FFTF, but also ATR, was used at least in some capacity for radionuclide production. And I think that also applies to isotopes. I mean, beyond neutrons, are we expecting that there will be, that VTR will be used this way as well?
So we have an ongoing study with the Office of Science's isotope program. They are looking at what kinds of isotopes could be produced in VTR from the spectrum standpoint of view. It's not envisioned, at least not at this point in time, that whatever isotopes that they come up with would be a production kind of capability, more of a beginning of isotope production analysis studies. Can it be done? Feasibility looks at it. Isotopes are typically short-lived and require quick ins and outs, and our only ability to do that with VTR would be through a rabbit. Otherwise, you're talking 100 days, so that kind of significantly limits down. But it certainly opens the door for the kind of research that might someday warrant the development of a smaller fast spectrum reactor suitable for isotope production. But
yeah, thanks. Well, and I want to bring Judy and Tara into this conversation as well. And maybe I think if we sort of zoom out a little bit, we've got a number of questions here that talk about the timeframes and talk about how 2026, how that overlays with what advanced reactors developers are doing now, and then noting congressional funding is uncertain. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Schedules tend to slip. Can you talk a little bit, maybe Tara first from a vendor perspective, but maybe Judy from a broader perspective of how the vendors are going to adjust, and work in tandem with the development of the VTR for their needs.
So obviously we can't rely on the VTR at a certain given period of time because that's subject to government appropriation. So we know that time moves around some on any government type contract. So one of the things that we did for our natrium reactor is decide early on that we were going to start with the fuel that was already discussed in terms of pretty well qualified fuel already that's been already demonstrated, rather than jumping into our advanced fuel right away. It slows us down not having a test reactor. And we can also do what we like to call bootstrapping, where we use our own reactor to do tests, but our reactor is intended for a commercial reactor, so we're not going to have the really high flux that is supposed to be demonstrated in the VTR. So it would be a much slower process if we don't have the VTR to get any improvements in our fuel and our materials. Much slower.
Judy, thoughts?
Yeah, let me answer this in two parts. First, about climate math. If we want to get deep decarbonization by mid-century, which I think is imperative, then working backwards, we have to be, we really should have been innovating yesterday, but we need to innovate as fast as possible. And nuclear can play an enormous role in helping to decarbonize the power sector, and most people know about that. But nuclear could also play a big role in decarbonizing fuels, which is also a big need. It can make zero carbon fuels like hydrogen that could be used by the transportation and industry sector, as well as making power. So there's a potentially enormous role for nuclear power, but in order for it to play that role, it needs to work well. It needs to address all of the issues that have plagued it in the past, and build on its past success, but also get even better performance, and particularly with respect to costs. And there's just enormous potential for the advanced reactor set of designs to be more cost competitive, to fit better into a power sector that needs smaller increments of power, more flexible increments of power, et cetera. So we really need it, and we need it as fast as possible. And then sort of translating that to what can the VTR do for us, it's less an innovation in and of itself, then it's an enabler of other innovations. So the sooner we can get it going, the more it can enable other innovations, some of which we don't know about yet. I mean, there's a lot. It's great to me that the VTR team is planning for the kinds of experiments that might happen, the kind of customers that might, or developers that might use a facility, but there's also just a bunch of things we don't know yet. And once the test facility is available, all kinds of potential innovations become more likely and more possible. So it has specific benefits that we know about, but it also has general benefits to the innovation ecosystem that are hard to even quantify. And so I'm pleased that the VTR team is focusing to get this facility as quickly as possible to not be so innovative in the facility itself, to relying more on things we know we could build on time and within budget so that we can enable all the others. So that's how I've been thinking about it, and I think it's I'm very excited about it, and I really do hope we succeed because it's important to the overall success of it.
It makes sense, and I think, you know, oftentimes when we enter into the discussion, you can see it in the sort of the approach of a couple of questions that we've received from the audience. But you know, the question they're asking is, hey, when will it be ready so we can get these first of a kind technologies up and running? But I guess my question is that the right way to approach it, or is that the right conversation to have, or shouldn't we be having a conversation of, you know, this project is going to have a 50-year lifespan, and there's going to be ongoing work. If we assume we're going to be, you know, developing and deploying Gen 4 technologies at scale in the 2030s and beyond, there's a continuing need for, you know, for the neutron field. So maybe Ray, if you want to talk about that from a regulatory perspective. I know we touched on it before, but thinking about it as an ongoing tool, and then you know, Tom and others can chime in as well.
Yeah, I'll start, Craig. I look back. I've been involved in test reactors most of my career, and over 30 years involved with ATR programs. And one thing that about test reactors or testing capabilities in general, I think there'll always be a continuing need, whether it's the VTR or anything else, because over that amount of time, we've inevitably get humbled by experiment results. We sometimes think we know all that there is that you need to know, and we're really good at simulation now, but we step back and these machines can really help tell us, okay, are your assumptions correct? When you have these integrated tests and you get experiment results, yeah, they can help validate the codes, but you can't get that information any other way sometimes. Can we do the number of tests, number of experiments that maybe we had the luxury of doing in the 60s and 70s and 80s? Probably not, but with a combination of modeling and simulation and really careful experiment designs like what you're doing, Sean, I think that combination is going to be needed for a long time, regardless of where at the stage we're at in the development of advanced reactors. So I think it's important in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to jump in on that?
I do, Craig. You know, a key piece to it is, you know, not only being able to do the kinds of benchmarking that Ray is talking about, but with the kind of DPAs you get out of VTR, you can throw lots of material in there and see what's, I mean, as Ray was talking, you know, in the old days it was cook and look. Now we're trying to do the modeling and analysis. But there's another key piece to it too, and that is that when you get into the design, by understanding better how your materials will perform, not only at 40 years or 60 years or 80 years, which is what we're trying to extend the current light water reactor fleet out to, that has potential for reducing the overall capital costs of construction, or better being able to optimize at what point in time you've got to swap equipment out. And in terms of fuel, I mean, we've been looking at, you know, 12-month outages, 16-month outages, and now we're at 18, and people are looking to take it to 24. And that's one of the other benefits of the accident-tolerant fuel, is coming up with claddings that will support the longer kinds of irradiation. And Tara can certainly talk to the kind of DPAs that her material is going to see, but if you can change, how frequently you have to undergo a refueling outage, much akin to what the Navy is doing, that really changes the ball game as to how cost competitive nuclear can be. And in terms of some of the things that Judy was talking about, that really opens the door for making the higher temperatures that these reactors operate available for non-electric applications. So whether it's hydrogen production or running a petrochemical plant or even oil refinery, hydrogen is, oil plants, gasoline refineries, I mean, they just distill off the carbon. Well, if you've got a fairly inexpensive source of hydrogen via a nuclear power plant, then you're 100% utilizing all of the carbon carrier available to you. And that's a huge step towards becoming this country that's carbon neutral. So VTR is going to have a huge role to play in doing that, not only in terms of the speed, but just being able to give that forward-looking understanding of how these materials are going to perform over decades.
Yeah, maybe
Nice.
I could add to that.
Yeah,
On
sure.
the on our materials testing in Russia, we had a long-term project there, and really because of various turns of events politically, we chose to stop that and are bringing the samples home now. They are only partially through what we wanted to irradiate them to, and we're going to try to keep them in the right storage conditions so that we can continue that irradiation later when the VTR is up and running. I really, we've now kind of formed the natrium from traveling wave reactor and PRISM. The traveling wave reactor had ambitions to have very, very, very high irradiation, and so we were trying to bring that up to the 200, 300 DPM, and we got partially there, and our materials are showing really great success. But until you get to that endpoint, you can't extend the time out. So this VTR would be really wonderful to continue that work.
So just to say it again, there's never enough data. And these multi-component tests are challenging to put together and expensive to put together. So you want to make sure you do it right, but there's always that law of unintended consequences. So you can get all the way to the end of a test and realize you should have done something else, and so you need another test. So you're not going to run out of things to do with this reactor just because we suddenly have another reactor type commercializing. There's going to be more data needed for additional things.
Well, and actually a question that follows this thread. Can you talk about the science basis for using accelerated irradiation data from the VTR to predict performance under lower dose rate power reactor environments? So in other words, is it just heating it up quicker, or are we going from oven to microwave? I mean, what's the scientific basis for using that accelerated irradiation?
I can start on that if you want. I'm sure others have something to say as well. But anytime you're trying to accelerate a mechanism, this is where the dual role of modeling and simulation comes in with what you're doing with irradiation. It's the same argument you have when you say, why bother using ion beams? Well, we can use the ion beam to get to 80 to 100 dPa if we need to. So at the same time, you're doing a totally different mechanism. And back when I used to do nuclear waste testing, we wanted to test something that's supposed to last 10,000 years, but we needed to do it in less than a year. And how do you know you're testing the same mechanisms and evaluating? And it gets down to, you generate the data you generate, the theories tell you what the theories are, and then you try to merge your understanding to make the best extrapolation possible in these accelerated conditions. And at the same time, having this venue gives you real data instead of imaginary data. And as I often tell my students, equilibrium happens. So a lot of stuff is going to happen in a multi-component test that you can't predict with your models. But once you have the data, it points you there. So even if you do an accelerated test and it's not quite the right damage rate, not quite the right conditions, you learn something about the process and you may be able to then simulate the right conditions. And at the same time, there's other reactors like ATR where you can do the right conditions. You just have to leave it in there for a very long time.
Good,
So
good.
this isn't the only venue for everything, is what I'm saying.
Right. That makes sense. Anybody else want to jump in on that before we go to the next audience question? So here's one. How does the integrated digital engineering framework or digital twin help on the design of VTR as well as on the reactor construction? What are the specific benefits?
So from a design standpoint of view, you've got to start with your set of requirements. And requirements also have overlaid on top of them codes, so ASME. So now you have your requirements, you have your codes, and now you begin your design and your iterations. You build a foundation based on how much you think the building is going to weigh. You have to then lay in structural seismic qualifications, and then you start throwing in piping that's going to impart its own kind of thermal loads onto the buildings and the structures. And oh, by the way, you've got to throw shielding in there. And if somebody says, well, I think that we need to have something last longer or change this code by having an integrated requirements management tied to all of the design codes, you see how any kind of requirement ripples through the structural, the thermal, the neutronics. And if you move a pipe because you need to have a bigger piece of equipment in, you understand, well, okay, now that means we've got to redo the thermal stresses, we've got to redo the seismic analysis on that pipe. So you understand how it all ripples, and at the end of the day, it cuts down on any kind of design changes because of, oh, we didn't see that because we were using 4 different kinds of drawing systems. It's all integrated in one. The piping, the electrical, the structural, all of those things are all laid in into one. And because the system ties in the analysis that goes into it all, then when you get into your actual performance and operations, in the event that you need to make a change, you can see how that change would affect or what it would affect. But as I pointed out before, you're effectively creating a digital twin of it. So Sean was talking about some of the modeling. Ray was talking about some of the modeling. By understanding this, now you have a benchmark against which you can run your computer code and validate it, and then take that on to build something else. So it's very, very important. And I might add, just even fundamentally, by having it all integrated, it helps us keep track of quantities, how much concrete, how much steel, how much wiring. And so by having much more accurate ability to do the cost estimate, that gives Congress, in essence, the confidence that we have a real solid estimate and that we're not just pulling numbers out of the air. That we believe that based on how thorough the design is and how advanced it is, that we can come up with a cost estimate that will be sustained at the end of the day.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that makes sense. It's and it seems to be in keeping with what's happening in other industries too, where you're seeing the modeling and simulation and design sort of unifying into one singular process. So I've got one last question. I think then we will maybe just do a round of quick closing comments, but one specifically on the supply chain. And the mention of the supply chain early on in the proposal. What are we seeing in terms of the supply chain being reinvigorated? What supply chain risk mitigation is being done in terms of doing due diligence on suppliers and sub-tier suppliers and potential vulnerabilities? Tom, but anybody else that wants to jump in, thoughts or thoughts on the supply chain, and I think it was specifically dedicated toward the VTR project.
So certainly, as I said, we're trying to take advantage of components and hardware that's been used before, but through attrition, those manufacturing capabilities have disappeared. Take for instance the control rod drive mechanisms. The design is out there, we have access to it, but the manufacturer is no longer doing it. So we've got to find somebody. And when you get into the kinds of manufacturing required for control rod drive mechanism, now that you have a vendor that's capable of doing that, that kind of opens the door for other reactor developers, not necessarily to take advantage of the exact concept that we've got, but certainly when you get into intellectual property, that's a consideration. But nonetheless, they've got the experience in coming up with being able to manufacture those kinds of things. So it's not just control rod drive mechanisms. Obviously, for a sodium-cooled fast reactor, an electromagnetic pump has limited, broader applicability. But when you get into the manufacture of nuclear-related heat exchangers, so for VTR, the intermediate heat exchanger is going to be hung inside the reactor vessel. You have the piping that needs to go into it. So again, reinvigorating the supply chain to ensure that we've got nuclear suppliers of ASME stamp materials available. So it's helping.
Thanks, Tom. Well, we've sort of reached the end of our time here. Before we close it up, I just want to open it up to the panel one more time. Is there any other dimension of this or thought that you have that's important for the larger community to sort of understand or think about as we go through this process? Any final thoughts?
Can I start, Craig?
Sure.
I think from the regulatory research perspective, I know I'm really excited about the possibilities that the VTR has to offer both the regulatory community as well as the vendors and the designers and DOE, and I'm excited about the collaboration we've got set up with you, Tom, and your folks as well. And Sean, I gotta bring up something you mentioned. It's all about there's never enough data. I thought you were a regulator there for a minute, but getting the data out of it, that is important. It helps with the code of validation, helps with reducing uncertainties and understanding those margins in design. I think that's important from a safety standpoint as well as from a economic viability standpoint, as understanding those margins. So I think the VTR can contribute to all of that. So thanks, Craig.
Thanks, Ray.
Well, I've never been a regulator, but I am working on a license application right now. So go ahead,
Tara.
Yeah, I was just going to follow Ray because, without the proper tools and ability to get testing done, you end up kind of being between a rock and a hard spot because, Ray and the rest of the NRC has to do their due diligence to make sure that all these reactors meet all of the safety requirements. And if we can't get that testing done, I think Tom and Sean might have mentioned some other types of testing that we've done as well, like the ion beam testing. But it's not perfect, and it's so we can kind of guess in terms of the behavior, but we don't want to be guessing. We want real data, and the VTR really fills in that niche.
Yeah. Thanks, Judy. Final thoughts?
Yeah, I guess I just want to re-emphasize how important testing is. I mean, maybe testing doesn't sound as sexy as some other aspects of innovation, but it's critical. And we're not going to be able to translate these cool designs into reality unless we test them and get confidence that they're going to work. And so it's really a critical part of the innovation ecosystem. And we're going to test and we're going to find out that some things don't work. And that's okay, because then we'll find out how to fix things and how to make sure that we are building things that are going to work. And so it's really critical. It's urgent actually, and it's going to be a very important aspect of success for advanced reactors so that they can play a role in
Yeah. Thanks, Judy. Well, that concludes our time here. I want to thank all of our panelists today. I thought it was a very good discussion. I want to apologize to the audience for literally the dozens of questions that we weren't able to get to in the time that we had available today. But I'm sure that there'll be other venues for those questions to be answered, and a lot, many more times to talk about the VTR in the future. So. It's clear, to sort of finish into the audience, I think it's sort of clear that the VTR is seen as having an important role to play in strengthening nuclear leadership and our overall decarbonization efforts. The U.S. has been a longtime leader in licensing, safety, operations, security. But let's face it, we've allowed ourselves to fall behind a little bit. We've allowed our tools to get a little rusty. And I think that the VTR sort of represents a part of a larger effort to, modernize our infrastructure, develop a new set of technologies, and really preserve our global leadership in the field, which provides benefits beyond just energy in terms of our national security and our ability to influence safety and non-proliferation norms around the world. So I think that we understand. I think hopefully you understand a little bit more about the benefits of testing and the benefits of data, but also recognizing that this is a long-term investment that is being proposed here, that it's not just a one shot to get the first set of reactors up and running, that it's part of a healthy nuclear research infrastructure that supports a new generation of technology. So, I want to thank Kamal for the overview. I want to thank our panelists, and then finally all of you in the audience for joining us today. You can stay up to date on the VTR program by going to inl.gov/VTR. But that concludes our programming for today. Thank you and have a good day.
Stay well.
Thank you.